Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us at this special event in which we will be exploring how, as we emerge from the lockdown, we should build back better. I'm Alexander Rhodes, head of Mishcon sustainability business, Mishcon Purpose, and I'll be hosting today's event. We are delighted to be holding this event together with the Athens Democracy Forum, to which Mishcon is the proud legal partner. We decided to hold today's event because we are at this critical moment in time. The world, and each of us individually, look to the future with uncertainty and trepidation. COVID-19 is a zoonotic coronavirus. As of yesterday, it's killed 605,979 people worldwide. Hundreds of thousands are unemployed or are staring it in the face. Tens of millions of people are threatened with a pandemic of hunger. The disease and the consequences of the lockdown have not treated everybody fairly. Pre-existing inequalities and discrimination have been highlighted. The Black Lives Matter movement in the United States has served further to uncover the structural nature of inequality in society. It's also true to say that the burden hasn't been shared equally. Some governments have provided unprecedented financial support to the private sector, as well as directly to citizens. Some companies have pivoted to provide public services and have treated their employees differently from others. Key workers have emerged as heroes from sectors which are amongst the lowest paid in society. Antonio Guterres, in his Earth Day speech, highlighted that while unquestionably coronavirus has been the biggest shock since the Second World War, it is forerunning the existential crisis that we face, which is climate change. We've been exhorted, therefore, not merely to build back, but to build back better. This concept comes from the United Nations Sendai Framework for Disaster Relief Reduction. We must not begin with a review of what we have, but a vision of what we want. We are very, very fortunate to have some incredible speakers with us today. And we will begin with Mete Koban, MBE, the Labour Councillor for Tower Hamlets, who will give our opening address, setting out his vision for better. Just before I introduce Mete, I'd like to thank particularly Patrick Chapat, the multi-award-winning editorial cartoonist. For 20 years, he was cartoonist for the International Herald Tribune and the New York Times, and his satirical work, Fighting the COVID-19, opened the event. It is humbling for me to introduce Mete Koban to give our opening vision.
Thank you very much, Alex, for your very kind introduction. It's such an honor to be here with you all, to be setting the vision for how we could build back a better society. And I guess I wanted to share with you my vision and how we can sort of build a socially inclusive economy, which we can put people at the heart of it rather than profits. At the height of the pandemic, on the 27th of March this year, I came across a headline that read, "All rough sleepers in England to be housed." An unthinkable and radical policy if mentioned just before the pandemic. This followed the UK's government's announcement of the furlough scheme, which paid businesses 80% of the salaries of their employees. The total support package totaled hundreds of billions of pounds in response to the coronavirus pandemic. How could it be that such a deep-rooted societal issue that has known no solution and has existed for many decades could be solved just in a click of a finger? One announcement from a government minister and immediately thousands of people were housed in a matter of weeks. So all this time, it must have been an issue of political will rather than capability. So this made me rethink about what our society could look like if we had the political will and urgency to address some of the very issues that the coronavirus pandemic exposed and amplified. I imagine the society where our children and young people receive a good education in good schools, one that's not based on a lottery ticket of where they're born. I imagine the society where 7 million people didn't have to die every year due to air pollution. And I imagined a society where opportunity wasn't limited or held from you because of the color of your skin or your background. And if we don't use this as a wake-up call, then these problems will only worsen. So the question is, how do we get there? I want to pitch the idea of building a socially inclusive economy partnership, one that puts people at the heart of growth, but also shares the task of responsibility between governments, businesses, and civil society. Technology companies have a particular big responsibility towards creating a more equitable and inclusive society. And this is likely due to the fact that digital businesses tend to have a wider geographic and social reach through the products and services that they provide. So I believe when you look at places like Hackney, for example, where I'm from, we have a place called Shoreditch, Hackney Wick, where it has huge numbers of tech and creative industries. And some of the things that we've been able to do is work with those industries to make sure that we're helping reskill and also improve the talent in Hackney. Because the last thing we want to see is for people like me who grew up in the area to not be able to access the opportunities that are being presented in our borough. You know, you see all these brilliant new houses that are being built. You see these amazing new jobs that are being created. But if we can't access it, what's the point? I think it's time that governments and local authorities start to recognize that we cannot take this task alone. And we have to make sure that businesses and civil society are also sharing the responsibility on how we can make sure that we create a much more inclusive society. So that's why I believe which is what Hackney is doing around the Inclusive Economy Partnership, and some of what's happening in different pockets of England and the wider of the UK, is a model that we could all start to build off to help rebuild our society. Thank you all for your time. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello. I'm Steve Erlanger. I'm the Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times, which is co-sponsoring this through the Athens Democracy Forum. This will be the first of two panels, which will explore the implications, risks, and opportunities of rebuilding following the pandemic. We have an extremely lively panel, I hope. So first is Vian Sharif, who's head of sustainability at the FNZ investment firm. Then James Libson, who is the managing partner of Mishcon, a litigator with a bunch of high profile cases. And Dhanajayan Sriskandarajah, who is the chief executive of Oxfam in Great Britain, and who has kindly allowed us to call him Danny for the purposes of this seminar. I'd like to start with a question. I'd start with Vian, if I may. As we think about equality and fairness, they're not exactly the same thing. And as we talk about trying to create a more just or more equal economy, how much responsibility does the private sector have in ensuring that the economy is restored in a way that might reduce inequality? And what do you think the private sector actually might be prepared to do about it?
So at FNZ, what we do is we are a financial technology company. What we do is we enable individuals to access their long-term savings. And what's interesting about that is that now, very, very shortly, individual people will start to be able to connect with their long-term savings in a way that they never have done before. They'll be able to see the environmental and societal footprint of every company in which they're invested. And that's what technology is enabling us to do. This is a result of things like the Business Roundtable, where it's been acknowledged that businesses have to become accountable to stakeholders as well as shareholders. And that's partly because it's becoming more and more transparent in terms of how they are responding on an environmental and societal basis, because data is everywhere.
Let me just pose the same question to James.
My sense in speaking to clients and speaking to colleagues is that there has been a fundamental change, that people at the moment are committed to building back better, to borrow the phrase of the conference. But the question, of course, will be how long that commitment lasts and what it looks like. And already, as we emerge from the early stages of the crisis, the Building Back Better agenda may fall back even in the first stages of it as people start to lose their jobs. For example, that doesn't feel like Building Back Better in particular for those people who are losing their jobs as they come off furlough support or whatever it is. And so I think it's very complex, and one needs to look at it both at the local level, the parochial level almost, and what you can do within your individual institutions and organizations, and then what leverage you can pull as an institution, as a relatively sizable institution in our case, with our clients, but with our colleagues as well, and see what you can do to affect society in that way.
Danny, what's your sense of private capital's willingness to get engaged in building something new as opposed to trying to restore what there has been?
One of the reasons why the economic crisis is being played out in the way that it is at the moment, and is because of the sort of irresponsible, vulgar bits of practice that have sort of fueled recent economic development. And I think a couple of things make me optimistic. I think one is that you know, we are recognizing that some of these practices are unsustainable. And I think more enlightened businesses were already working on addressing some of these. This is going to make that process faster. And the other reason is that consumer behavior seems to be changing. I mean, I think we are on the cusp of some fairly dramatic changes in the way that people will consume, the way people will hold capital to account. And that's, to me, the big prize in terms of building back better. Can we come up with, you know, carrots and sticks that will make the most of this opportunity?
We have this COVID crisis and it's not over. At the same time, we have this climate crisis, the problem of carbon and CO2, and the need to truly transform our economies. Do you think there's a conflict between going green and giving people work now?
Clean energy infrastructure is much more labour intensive in the early stages of creating it. So for every £1 million in spending, you get 7.5 full-time jobs created, as opposed to fossil fuel economies where you get about 2.5. This is just one example of how shifting to a decarbonised economy can actually be economically not just viable but prosperous. Carbon emissions themselves being emitted by companies, this is probably the one area which is most forward-thinking in terms of how it's being reported. So the likes of the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures is making sure that if you are a subscriber to the UN Principles for Responsible Investing, the companies in which you're invested in have to report their carbon emissions. And this will come through into reporting, and institutional capital will start to understand that. Pension funds in the UK already have to report on what their climate strategy is. And so if they're looking at companies like this and they're seeing the data, then they may not want to go down the route of investing in a company which isn't looking after these things. So it may be a balance of push and pull of all of these factors.
James, I know one thing that interests you is the role of the state and how much larger that role seems to have become during this crisis. How do you restrain it, or are people grateful to it?
I think people have tolerated it for the time being, and they will tolerate it while that power is being used for the benefit of the societies in which we live, but won't tolerate it once it's abused. And then it will be for people to challenge that appropriation of power and to see whether it will be rolled back and it will be let go. Governments don't tend to like to let go of power once they've appropriated it to themselves.
One of the other things governments can do is change the tax structure. Do you think there's an opportunity for something like that, or does it just seem altogether too radical?
Even before COVID in Britain, for example, a majority of people supported some rise in taxation because they recognized there needed to be some form of redistribution. And we're seeing polling already of great interest amongst the public for fundamental and radical shifts in the way that the economy works, including the taxation system. At Oxfam, we work with a group called the Patriotic Millionaires. It's a fantastic group of people who have already been, very successful, millionaires and billionaires, who are themselves saying that it's only right that society taxes people like them more fairly because they've had it good, but they don't think it's the right thing that wealth and income has been allowed to be accumulated at such eye-watering levels.
One of the issues which you've now all raised is this debt mountain that's being created. I mean, we're kind of seeding this for the future. Is this a generational problem, do you think? Can you build back better without harming people younger than ourselves?
So many of the problems we've bequeathed the world are generational problems, whether it's that or climate change or anything else. The very nature of the problems that we have created, they are a generational problem. And our responsibility, obviously, as the runners of business or the policymakers or the influencers, is to try and ameliorate the inheritance.
I do want to just ask very quickly whether corporates should have a distinct public role in tackling inequality. What should corporates be doing, or can corporates be doing that states are not doing to break this increasing inequality, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world?
This is a moment, a radical moment for not just governments to rethink what they're doing, but actually for business to rethink. And perhaps this is a once in a generation moment for them too, to say, okay, well, how do we start to address this? What are the practical measures that we can take? Partly because we are going to be held accountable, whether we like it or not, we will be held accountable for what we do here.
Yes, and I think that's actually quite a good thought to end on. I think we're all going to feel accountable. And the question is, what do we as individuals, what do we as corporate people, what do we as NGOs, what are we actually going to do about it? So with that rhetorical note, let me thank Bjorn, thank James, thank Danny for a very nice conversation, and hand over back to our organizers.
Hello, everybody. I'm Liz Alderman. I'm the European economics correspondent for the New York Times based in Paris. I am really happy to be hosting this next panel. We are going to be focusing on what are the bold actions needed to create a just transition and to build back better. Governments are more present than ever before to counter the economic hardships of the COVID crisis. I'm going to be asking our panelists to tease out concrete solutions and specific innovations that will be needed to build back better. Let me just refresh everybody's memory about who we have joining us today. David Teese, very happy to welcome you. You're the co-founder of the 1,500-person Berkeley Research Group, and obviously a renowned economist and an authority on industrialization, technological change and innovation. Mariana Mazzucato, you're the professor at University College London, of course, a leading international economist and the author of the book, The Value of Everything, a critique of modern capitalism, focusing on the need for innovation to address these massive crises that we're facing. And Valerie Keller, the co-founder and CEO of Imagine. And in your role, you help global corporations become what you call purpose-led and future fit. Mariana, let me start, if I could, with you. You have argued that the COVID crisis is a chance to do capitalism differently. So can you just talk to us a little bit about how capitalism can be done differently and what concrete actions are needed to get there?
Yeah, I mean, people like myself with kids at home, not in school, are using this word like, let's go back to normal. And I think we need to resist that, because normality is what got us into the crisis that we're in. It's also what got us into the financial crisis. It's also what's given us the climate crisis, these kind of three impending crises that are kind of intersecting. I just hope it's a real wake-up call on how we need to kind of redesign our institutions and the relationships between them. I think this is the moment to really walk the talk of stakeholder capitalism. I was in Davos this year. That was the talk of the town, this notion of purpose-driven corporate governance, stakeholder capitalism. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that. We're seeing many companies, for example, that talk the purpose talk that are still expecting just to get massive bailouts without any conditionality. So that's kind of my big takeaway. Let's really use this moment to work together to get a better form of capitalism that really is stakeholder driven. And that means really changing the way that public and private sector interact, whether it's on the bailouts, the vaccine, or a COVID drug.
Well, Valerie, that is actually a perfect opening for me to pivot to you. Can you respond to that concern that companies these days are still not walking that talk?
We realize now even more than ever that we can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. So the global solidarity, this kind of big we that I would say that we're in, I think is ever more important. And we're seeing the inadequacy of our social constructs. Oxfam has shown we've got 500 more people that are being put into poverty, 265 million more that are experiencing food shortages. We're not unaware of that. What we are aware of is that global governance is broken. And I think what we are seeing is that the private sector leaders are stepping up, not as the heroes to help save the world, but as human beings who are saying, I'm living as part of this world. I can't be healthy on an unhealthy planet. We are seeing actually hearteningly, and in some cases, maybe even more surprisingly, that responsible business models and people are actually focusing now on more of the S of ESG. So we're seeing that companies are focusing on lives and livelihoods. Again, it's not everybody, but if you look at examples like IKEA spending money on training or Salesforce guaranteeing jobs, Unilever. So my co-founder is a former CEO of Unilever, Paul Pullman, but the current CEO of Unilever, Alan Jope, gets on the phone with me 2 weeks after and says, look, we're going to be providing 500 million in loans to smaller suppliers. We're taking care of our people and we're thinking about the people, the we of our company as being not just the talent that we have, but actually the people whose lives depend on us.
Absolutely. Let me pivot to David. At this point, is more state the answer to our problems? And if not, where is the innovation going to come from that is going to be needed to get us out of this crisis?
The best way to get out of this crisis is to favor the future. We're being engaged overall in strategies which are all about the here and now. And that is shortchange the future. And in my view, yes, a multi-stakeholder view, but the way to get there is to actually not confuse management by telling them their role is to fix everything in society, but tell them their role is to be great stewards of their corporations and invest in growth for the long term. And if they do that, they're going to have to take account of other constituencies. But to just tell them their job is to fix society, they don't know what to do in the boardroom. And in many cases, they're not the best people to fix society, and they don't know how to make the trade-offs. That's where they can work together with government. But I think if we change our corporate governance and we get people on boards of directors who support managers that are investing in research and development, investing in the projects that'll bring forward the new technologies that'll improve the environment, that'll improve human health, and invest for the long term. Don't extract value from companies, but continue to invest it. Then I think we've got a better chance of getting where everyone wants to go.
Mariana, on that point, I mean, you had recently actually written an op-ed piece for the Times that ran earlier this month, in which you noted that, when the economy is in crisis, we often turn to governments to fix the problems. But when things pick up, it's the companies that reap the rewards. Explain to us, what is at the basis of your argument there? Why do you think that the cycle must be broken? Is COVID a chance to do that?
Just look at the, Solyndra and the Tesla investment by the US government after the financial crisis. They both got more or less 500 million in a guaranteed loan. When Solyndra went bust, everyone knew about it, bad public sector investment, bad public, good private. So government stopped meddling. When the same amount of money went to Tesla, that was considered a private sector success. There was no talk even within the Obama administration, no narrative, no kind of storytelling about what this portfolio looked like, but also there was no structuring of that portfolio in a way that any logical investor or venture capitalist would. And in fact, they structured it the opposite. Obama told Tesla, if you don't pay back the loan, we get 3 million shares in your company. Why you would want 3 million shares in a crappy company that doesn't pay back the loan is beyond me. Had he said, when you pay back the loan, which they did in 2013, we get 3 million shares in your company, the price per share went up from something like $9 to $90 per share. That difference multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss in the next round. If we accept that value is created collectively, the kind of key point of my book on value, then we should make sure we have a pre-distribution strategy. So the relationships between government, business, civil society organizations, including trade unions, kind of embed this notion of value creation also in terms of how it's then distributed, right? So it's not just taxation that redistributes wealth, it's the relationships like through a wealth fund, a citizen's dividend, equity stakes by the public sector in certain types of investments that are downstream, like the ones I mentioned. I think that's the new kind of thinking. And that means that the progressive agenda needs to think just as much about wealth creation as wealth distribution.
Should governments stay out of the way? Or should we figure out sort of a new way for governments and businesses to work together to produce new innovations that ultimately could be provide new types of job creation? Because one of the other things that we're seeing right now is obviously sort of massive job destruction.
I actually think it is time for everybody to double down in supporting science and technology and innovation. You know, there are bills introduced in the United States Congress that would double the budget of the National Science Foundation and so forth, which I support. But Mariana is right. I mean, the private sector often doesn't realize or give enough credit for what government does. And I think that there won't be the political support for more investment in science and technology unless the co-investment piece picks up markedly. Now, there are some companies like Tesla, of course, where they're pouring billions into R&D as well. But there are many companies that are over-leveraged, that there's been value extraction, they've cut back on R&D, and then they seek government support. I would not be in favor of that. I mean, if companies are willing to deleverage, if they stop the stock buyback game, if they reduce dividends and build for the future, that's what's going to create jobs. That's what's going to create new technologies.
Well, those are very interesting points. In Europe, we have many governments basically giving a huge amount of financial backing to businesses to keep them afloat, and also paying businesses to keep employees on paid furlough in order to prevent mass unemployment from breaking out. The United States is also providing huge support, but in a different way. There certainly seems to be a concern in Europe about what's going to happen to all of these businesses. Are we going to see kind of a collapse coming?
First of all, I think when you're in a crisis and a recession, we're all Keynesians in the sense that we do need government stimulus. But I think we have to be working towards creating robust companies. And yes, we don't want to prop up weak companies. But as we go through this crisis and come out the other end, I think we've got to build companies that are robust enough that they don't need government bailouts. And I think part of the regulatory apparatus, part of the governance apparatus, part of the responsibility of boards of directors is to make sure that balance sheets are strong enough to not allow stock buybacks unless the balance sheet really can warrant it.
It's not so much about becoming independent of government, otherwise actually there'd be no innovation. It's about structuring these partnerships in a better way. Shaping the market, not just fixing the market, requires a much more attentive kind of lens on how to partner properly. And it's not about independence from the state, it's about a much more interesting relationship.
What has been fascinating and exciting to me in the wake of the crisis was talking to fellow CEOs who were saying, yep, we've got business continuity. As David's saying, of course we need to stay alive and keep our robustness. But what was also exciting for me was to see CEOs who were saying, and this is an opportunity to do the innovations that we know that we needed at speed and scale. And not just private sector in the abstract, but groups of CEOs, 30% or more of a value chain coming together to say, how can we actually help transform a market and how can we work with the regulators to help lift the floor for everybody?
That'll be the big test going forward is, how successful is this all going to be? Governments working together with businesses and in general, moving to construct a better post-COVID world. We're going to have to leave it on that note. I want to thank all of you for a really robust discussion. And one that has been incredibly thought-provoking, I think, to all of our viewers. Thanks to all of you.
I'm delighted to introduce Professor Anthony Julius, Deputy Chairman of Mishcon and Chair of Law and the Arts at UCL.
Let me pose the question of COVID-19. Has it changed everything? The parallel phenomenon of Black Lives Matter suggests, to the contrary, that the great structural inequalities are still with us and no real change there. Indeed, it seems to me a good test to determine our location in the global hierarchy to ask, has everything changed or just got a bit worse? But for sure, transformation or mere further deterioration, the virus has commanded our attention. Its immediate impact, it seems to me, and arising from my reflections on this afternoon, to have been twofold. First of all, a reminder, and secondly, a reintroduction. The reminder of both our individual, our human vulnerabilities, physical and economic, but also a reminder of the state's capabilities as an active political economic agent. I mean, we have seen over the last couple of decades the state's role as a war-making agent, but as an active political economic agent, there is some novelty here, and our sense of both these vulnerabilities and capabilities has been mediated by what I think is a revived, maybe even revivified sense of global interdependence. The reintroduction is a reintroduction into the West, at any rate, of a political phenomenon absent through the long 19th century, but defining of the short 20th century, and that is catastrophe. And many of us, those of us perhaps not immediately instead fending off mortal danger or economic disaster, have found ourselves contemplating catastrophe, by which I mean the near complete collapse in given systems, however suboptimal already, which we look at with a sense of our own powerlessness. So what is to be done? Reform doesn't seem to be adequate to 19th century, and revolution is of course off the table, which is perhaps we can say to 20th century, that the offered phrase instead is building back better, which is as an aspiration is both bolder than reform, but no mere iterative improvement of an existing model, and more realistic than revolution, which of course risks mere intensification of catastrophe for many well-known reasons. But aspirations need programs and agents to pursue them. Among the programs identified, that what came out of this afternoon was that the radical recasting of tax regimes. This emerged as something approaching the precondition for much else: universal basic income, industry adjusting, climate change initiatives, intergenerational justice, reduced inequality, and so on. Among the agents of change identified in the conference, businesses, states, shareholders, consumers, NGOs, interstate and superstate entities, and philanthropy. The panelists, of course, identified certain problems with each. Businesses are structurally, constitutively self-interested. Can capitalism be done differently? States are structurally, constitutively power-hungry, and many of them, as we know, run by pretty dangerous people. What's more, states and businesses don't always cooperate in the interests of their citizens or the wider world. Shareholders are also self-interested when they don't actually have an institutional duty to maximize profits. Consumers are mostly too heterogeneous a bunch and too passive to act decisively over an extended period. If I sound a little glum, it's because the panelists did such a good job in mapping out the landscape. And I want to add my own thanks to every one of them. Allow me also to thank Alex Rhodes for his contribution to the conceiving of this event.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you to all of our speakers for leading us in such a rich conversation this afternoon. It is, as they have surely made clear, our responsibility to determine which route we want to take, and to determine who should lead on that journey. As a firm, we're committed to playing our part in shaping that journey with our clients, our partners, and in society as a whole. In 10 years, we have to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals as a world. And the next step, I think, on the journey of this conversation will be in the next 3 months at the Athens Democracy Forum, where we'll be considering the new abnormal. It seems to me that a clear shared articulation of better is fundamental, and that we have to address inequality, and we have to address climate change. And probably that we can't address the second without the first. It's also clear that we're all in this together, and that requires more responsibility and more accountability in our systems and our frameworks. Plainly, we haven't adequately valued people or our planet in our economic system, and we're now reaping these consequences. So these things are there for us to discuss, and there's a lot to do in terms of thinking about bringing that into our day-to-day lives and businesses. Thank you very much for joining the conversation, and we look forward to taking it forward with you.